The first thing Dara noticed was that the stars were wrong. Not wrong in the way stars get wrong when you're deep in a nebula corridor and the nav filters are compensating for dust scatter. Wrong in the way that makes the back of your neck go cold. The way that means something has happened to you that the instruments haven't caught up to yet. She was sitting in the co-pilot seat of the Cassidy, watching the viewport, and the stars she was looking at were not the stars she had fallen asleep to 6 hours ago. The constellations had shifted, not drifted, shifted, as if someone had reached into the sky and moved them by hand. "Ren," she said. No answer from the pilot's seat. Ren Calvo was asleep over the controls, one arm crooked under his head, his mouth slightly open. He'd been flying for 11 hours straight when she took over the watch, and she hadn't had the heart to wake him. She had the heart now. "Ren." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Wake up." He came up blinking, the way pilots do, fast, trained, eyes sweeping the boards before they're even fully conscious. "What's?" "Look at the viewport." He looked. 3 seconds of silence. Then, "That's not right." "No." He started pulling up nav data and she already knew what he was going to find, because she'd been looking at it for the past 4 minutes. The nav computer was reading their positions as 31 light hours from where they'd been. The drives hadn't fired, the fuel consumption was unchanged, there was no log entry, no transit record, no gap in the ship's chronometer. According to every instrument on the Cassidy, they had simply stopped being in one place and started being in another. The comms crackled. Hessa's voice from the crew bunk. "Someone want to tell me why we just picked up a colony beacon?" Dara and Ren looked at each other. The colony was called Vithara Station, and it was not supposed to exist. They pulled up the registry record in under a minute. Vithara Station had been a deep frontier agricultural outpost, one of the early expansion settlements built during the second wave of the Reach program, when humanity was still optimistic enough to drop a few thousand people on marginal worlds and tell them to figure it out. The record showed an establishment date, a population census, a handful of trade filings, and then 11 years ago, a closure notice. The stations had been decommissioned. All personnel evacuated. The site was listed as dormant. The beacon they were receiving was not dormant. It was strong, clear, and cycling on the standard colonial active frequency. The frequency that meant people were there, the lights were on. "Come on down." "Could be automated," said Ren. "Could be," said Dara, who didn't believe it. Hessa came up from the crew bunk, with her coffee in one hand, and the sleeves of her pressure suit pushed up to the elbows. She was their engineer, which on a 3-person courier run meant she was also their medic, their cargo handler, and the person who knew where they kept the spare fuses. She looked at the nav display, looked at the beacon reading, and said, "Huh, that's a word for it," Dara said. "We going down?" Dara thought about it. They were 6 days out from Meridian Station and 4 days out from their intended destination, a cargo full of agricultural microprocessors that nobody was going to die without. Beacon was on a Class 2 habitable world, breathable air, stable gravity, no listed hazards. And somebody had moved their ship 31 light hours in the night without touching the engines. "We're going down," she said. The descent was smooth and the planet was green, which was the first strange thing, because the registry listed Vithara as a semi-arid world with limited surface vegetation. From the cockpit, banking through the upper atmosphere, it looked lush. Forests running all the way to the horizon, punctuated here and there by geometric clearings that were too regular to be natural. The colony was in one of those clearings. They saw it from 3 kilometers out. Cluster of prefab structures arranged in the standard wheel pattern, solar arrays intact, ag domes green and full, lights on in the windows. Everything looked operational. Everything looked fine. That was the second strange thing. They sat down on the landing pad, and Dara was the first one out, with the hand scanner running before her boots hit the permacrete. The scanner read atmosphere as breathable, radiation as negligible, local biome as stable. Put the scanner away, and looked at the colony, and felt the hair on her arms stand up. There were people moving between the buildings, a dozen of them at least, visible from where she stood. They were going about what looked like ordinary business, carrying equipment, moving between structures, the normal rhythm of a working settlement. None of them had reacted to the Cassidy's landing. "Hello," she said, loud enough to carry, A few faces turned toward her, blank, pleasant faces. Somebody raised a hand in greeting. And then they went back to what they were doing. She walked toward the nearest cluster of people, and that was when she noticed the third strange thing. The equipment they were carrying was wrong. Not wrong in a broken way, wrong in a dated way. The fabricators they were using were a model she recognized from her training materials, the kind that had been phased out 12 years ago. The environmental suits two of the workers were wearing near the eastern ag dome had the old tab and seal collar closures that had been replaced by current magnetic system after a series of pressure failures. The solar arrays, now that she was closer, were the older low-efficiency panels, not the current generation. The colony was not operating in the present, it was operating in the past. She found Ren and Hessa behind her, and the three of them stood together in the middle of the colony square and turned slowly, taking it all in, and Ren said, very quietly, "Year do they think it is?" They found out from a woman named Petra. Petra was not like the others. The others had looked at three crew members of the Cassidy with that bland, pleasant acknowledgement, and then returned to their routines with the smoothness of people. Following a script they didn't know they were following. Petra looked at them, the way a person who has been drowning looks at a rope. She grabbed Dara's arm in the middle of the square and pulled her sideways into the gap between two prefab units and said, in a voice so controlled it was nearly flat, "You're from outside, you actually just arrived." 20 minutes ago, Dara said. "What's happening here?" "How many cycles has it been?" Petra said. "Tell me, what's the date?" "On your ship's chronometer, what is the actual date?" Dara told her. Petra closed her eyes and something moved across her face that was too complicated to name. 11 years, she said. She sat with them in the shadow of the prefab units, and she talked. She was concise about it, the way people get when they've had a very long time to organize their thoughts. She said it had happened without warning. A pulse of something that wasn't light and wasn't sound, something that passed through the station like a wave through water. And then everything had continued exactly as before, except that the date had jumped backward, not far, just 18 hours to the previous day. The day that would, as the hours unfolded, become the worst day in the colony's history. That night, the night after the pulse, the dying began. Not everyone, not all at once. The ones who went out past the colony perimeter after dark did not come back. And in the morning, they were alive again. Standing in the square, going about their routines as if nothing had happened, as if it was still the morning of that same day. And it just keeps going, Hessa said. Every cycle. 18 hours of day, the night, and whatever happens in the night, and then morning again. "How many cycles have you been through?" Ren asked. "I stopped counting after a few hundred." She looked at her hands. "Most people don't remember. They live the cycle, they die if they're going to die, and they wake up the next morning fresh. They don't carry it. But some of us do. I'm one of 3 people in this colony who know what's happening to us." 3, Dara said. "Myself. A man named Ovar who works the filtration systems. And Silas who runs the colony's technical operations." She paused. "Silas and Ovar were the ones who found you on the landing pad. They're the ones who will tell you they've been trying to break the cycle, that they need outside help, that you're the key." Something in the way she said it made Dara look up. "Petra," she said carefully, "is that not true?" Petra looked at her for a long moment. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Let me tell you a few more things first. Let me tell you about what happens in the night." She told them about the things in the dark. They were not human, they were not from the colony, and they were not from this world. They had been here before the colony arrived. The colonists had discovered traces of them in the geological record. Structures buried in the bedrock that predated human presence by what the dating equipment suggested was somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years. The colonists had classified this as an archaeological curiosity and filed a report that had evidently never been read by anyone who mattered because no follow-up team had ever arrived. The things, Petra called them wards, which was her word for them, her private word. The word she'd arrived at after hundreds of cycles of watching them work. The wards came out at night. They moved through the colony methodically, silently, with the precision of something executing a very well-designed system. They killed selectively, not randomly. They want your positions a certain way, at certain locations, at certain points in the cycle's progression, as if they were running an experiment, as if they were testing variables. They're learning something, Dara said. They've been learning something for 11 years, Petra said. The cycle is their laboratory. The colony is their subject. And the reset, Ren said slowly. They reset it every morning. That's what I believe. The pulse that started it, I think that was them. Think they found us. And decided we were interesting. And they set up the loop so they could study us indefinitely without running out of material. Hessa let out a long, controlled breath. Right. And we just flew straight into it. Your ship, Petra said. Can you leave? They already knew the answer. Dara had been running the calculations in the back of her mind since she'd seen the stars from the viewport. The drives are functional, she said. But we can't get a nav lock. Every time we try to calculate a jump, the system cycles back to the position it had when we landed. We're anchored here the same way you are. Petra nodded like she'd expected this. They moved your ship here, into the field. She rubbed her face with both hands. I'm sorry, I didn't know they could do that. How far does the field extend? Ren asked. As far as we've ever tested, about 12 kilometers from the colony center. She hesitated. Just one of the things I need to tell you about Silas. They found Silas in the technical operations building, a lean man with the careful stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time in confined spaces, sitting in front of a display array that was showing. Dara registered this with a cold slide of recognition. What appeared to be a map of the cycle, 18 hours broken into segments, markers at the points where deaths occurred. Notes in small, neat text beside each marker. He greeted them warmly. He had coffee, which he offered, and Dara noticed that it was good coffee, fresh, the kind you make for guests. He had clearly been expecting them. He expressed sympathy about the Cassidy's nav situation. He explained, clearly and thoughtfully, he believed the loop could be broken, that it required a specific action at a specific point in the cycle, an intervention at the source of the pulse. He said the source was located about 9 kilometers out, structure partially excavated from the bedrock. He said that Petra and Ovar had never been willing to attempt it, but that with outside help, he believed it was possible. He was compelling. He was organized. He had data. Dara listened carefully and watched his hands, and thought about the map on the display, and the fact that the notes beside the death markers were not written in alarm or grief, but in the dry, clinical shorthand of someone cataloging results. She thought about what Petra had said. It's complicated. Give us a few hours, she told Silas. We need to rest and get our bearings. He smiled and said, of course, take all the time they needed. The cycle wouldn't reset until morning. In the corridor outside, she pulled Ren and Hessa close. Don't go anywhere after dark, she said. Either of you. Care what reason anyone gives you. Not Silas, not Ovar, not anyone. You think Ren started. I think he's been running his own experiment, Dara said. And I think we just became his new variables. The colony sang at sunset. It was the strangest thing. As the light began to fail and the shadows lengthened across the permacrete square, the colonists, all of them, the ones who didn't remember, the ones who were going to die tonight and wake up tomorrow not knowing it, gathered in the square around a central fire pit, and they sang. Old songs, the kind that get carried from Earth to every outpost humans have ever planted, because you can travel 30 light years from your homeworld, but you still know the words to the same songs your grandmother knew. They sang in a loose, unself-conscious circle, and their faces in the firelight were open and unguarded. And Dara sat on a crate at the edge of the square and watched them and felt something in chest that she couldn't quite name. Hessa sat down beside her. Beautiful and terrible, Hessa said. Yeah, they don't know. No. A pause. Hessa was quiet for a moment, and then she said, we need to figure this out, Dara, before dark. I know. Dara had spent the 3 hours since leaving Silas's building doing what she always did when she needed to understand something. She moved through it. She walked the colony. She looked at everything. Not the things people pointed at, not the things she was directed toward, the edges, the places between places, the things that were slightly out of alignment. She found Ovar at the filtration systems, as Petra had said, a heavyset, quiet man who confirmed everything Petra had told her with the exhausted precision of someone who has told the same story hundreds of times. He added one detail that Per had left out. Silas had been in the early cycles, the one who kept accurate records. The one who had documented the deaths, the timings, the ward movements. Ovar had helped. Together, over hundreds of cycles, they had built up an extremely detailed picture of how the loop worked. And then, Ovar said, his voice going careful, going neutral. About 3 years in, Silas had changed. He had stopped grieving the deaths. He had started optimizing around them, positioning certain colonists in certain places, at certain times, to test whether the wards could be redirected. And when it became clear that they could, that the pattern wasn't fixed, that choices made by the living altered who the wards took, Silas had begun to make choices. He's been feeding them, Dara said. Ovar looked at the floor. He believes that if he can demonstrate sufficient cooperation, they'll let him out of the cycle, that they're studying him specifically, that he's special to them. Is he? I don't know. But I know that when outsiders arrived in previous cycles, there have been 2 other ships, yours. He convinced them to go to the excavation site at night, and they didn't come back, and the next morning the cycle reset as usual. The singing from the square drifted between the buildings. Somebody had started a round, 3-part, clean harmonies, and even out here in the filtration bay, filtered through prefab walls and the low hum of the water processors, it was lovely. He wants to put us in their place, Dara said. He thinks if he gives them something new, something they haven't processed yet, they'll let the old subjects go. That's my belief. She stood there and let the logic of it settle. She thought about 11 years of nights. She thought about 2 ships before the Cassidy, and 2 crews who had followed Silas into the dark and not come back. She thought about the wards, their field, their loop, their patient, methodical harvest. And she thought about what they were actually studying. Not the deaths specifically, the responses, the decisions, the things that happened in between. She thought about what Petra had said. They've been learning something. She went back to the Cassidy. The ship was dark and smelled like the inside of the Cassidy always smelled, which was coffee and ozone and the particular dusty undertone of recycled air that no amount of filter replacement ever fully eliminated. Dara sat in the co-pilot's seat with her knees pulled up and her datapad on her lap and worked. She pulled every record she could access. The ship's historical database, the colonial archives she'd copied from the station's library node, the geological survey data that someone had filed 11 years ago and never acted on. She cross-referenced, she built a timeline. She made notes in her own careful shorthand, different from Silas's, but not so different that she couldn't recognize the kinship, and she didn't like what that recognition felt like. An hour before dark, Wren knocked on the door and came in and sat in the pilot's seat and looked at her notes without asking. He was good at reading her notes. They'd been flying together for 3 years. The pulse, he said. It's not a field, no. It's a signal. I think so. I think it's broadcasting, casting the state of the loop. Everything that happened during the cycle, back to something. Somewhere. Wren was quiet for a moment. Port. A report. They document everything that happens in the cycle, and they transmit it at the reset point. The reset is part of the transmission process. They're not keeping the colony alive because they need the subjects. They're keeping it alive because a live subject population generates ongoing data. And if the transmission were interrupted, then either the loop breaks because there's no reset signal, or she stopped, or, Wren said, or the wards try to fix it. And we'd have maybe a few minutes inside the window where the system is compromised before they restore it, before they decide to do something else. He looked at the viewport. Outside, the colony's lights were warm against the darkening sky. The singing had stopped. Dara could hear the quiet of impending nightfall settling over the structures. That particular quality of silence that she had already begun to associate with the approach of danger, even though she had only been here a matter of hours. She thought about the people out there who had been living in this silence for 11 years, most of them not knowing what was coming, waking up every morning fresh and unaware. She thought about what it meant that 3 people knew. 3 people had been allowed to accumulate memory across the resets while everyone else was cleared. Wren, she said, The ones who remember, why do they remember? He looked at her. She watched him work through it. The wards need continuity, he said slowly. For the study to mean anything, they need someone who can compare cycles, track changes. But they can't do it themselves without being too visible in the data. They need a research assistant, Dara said. Someone who runs inside the cycle, who's part of the subject population, but who maintains longitudinal memory. Someone who can tell them whether the variable they changed in cycle 400 produced a different result than the same variable in cycle 200. Wren said. Silas is their collaborator. Knowingly or not, he's been serving the function either way. She closed the datapad. Pritra isn't. Pritra is what happens when the variable goes wrong. A subject who developed long-term memory but didn't cooperate with the intended use. She's a data anomaly. So is Ovar. That's why Silas is trying to remove outside variables. New ships, new people, their noise in the data. Protecting the study. Outside, something moved in the dark between the buildings. Not a colonist. Something else. A shape at the edge of visibility, there and then not there. Quality of motion that was not quite how things that had evolved under gravity were supposed to move. The excavation, Dara said. Source structure. 9 kilometers out. Silas said. Silas said it's where we need to go to break the loop. He said it because he wants to go there at night, where the wards are waiting. But he wasn't entirely wrong. She looked at Wren. We need to go there, just not at night. And not to break the loop from the outside. She spent the rest hour explaining what she meant. Hessa, when she heard the plan, said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, you want to corrupt the transmission. Not corrupt. Interrupt and inject. There's a difference. Not to the signal there isn't. The Cassidy's long-range comm array is calibrated for deep space broadcast. If we can get close enough to the source structure, we can overlay our own signal on top of whatever they're transmitting during the reset window. If we do it right, Hessa said. We broadcast human data directly into whatever is receiving the ward report. Data they haven't seen. Data that isn't part of their study design. She was quiet for a moment. You want to confuse their home office. I want to make the loop scientifically useless to them, Dara said. I want to introduce so much noise into the dataset that continuing the experiment is more costly than ending it. And if that makes them angry, then we deal with that. How? The same way humans have always dealt with things that are bigger and older and more powerful than us, Dara said. Figure it out as we go and we don't give up. Hessa looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to need about 4 hours to recalibrate the array. You have 2. Then I'm going to need to be very fast. They moved before the next morning's reset. This was Dara's calculation, and it was what she'd been working toward all along. Not the night, when the wards were active, and the colony's geometry was at its most dangerous, but the transition window, that narrow seam between the reset and the resumption of the cycle, when the signals was still transmitting, and the wards were occupied with the mechanics of the loop. She told Petra what they were doing. She did not tell Silas. At 3 in the morning by the Cassidy's chronometer, she and Wren went for the rover. Hessa stays on the ship, one hand on the comm array calibration board, and the other on a timer, counting down to the window. The plan was simple in the way that only plans that have been stripped of everything unnecessary are simple. Simple not because it was easy, but because everything extra had been cut away. Get to the structure. Get the array pointed at the source. Give Hessa the signal. Hold the overlay for as long as the window lasted. The rover was in the colony's motor pool, a standard 6-wheeled colonial surface vehicle, dusty and slightly battered, the kind of machine that does its job without complaint. Dara drove. Wren sat in the passenger seat with a handheld comm unit and a borrowed colony map on his datapad, navigating by landmarks because the rover's own GPS was part of the lockdown network. The forest started at the edge of the cleared colony zone and closed in fast. The headlights pushed 2 pale cones through the dark, and the dark pushed back. Dara drove at a pace she could control, not slow enough to give Hessa's timer a problem, not fast enough to lose the vehicle to a root or a rock. She did not think about what was in the forest. She thought about the route, the distance, the signal, the window. Wren was quiet for most of it. He had a habit of going inward when he was frightened, going quiet and still. She had learned not to mistake it for calm. At 4 kilometers out, he said, "I've been thinking about what they're studying." "Yeah? Keep saying they're studying the colony, the responses, the decisions. But I think it's more specific than that." He paused. "Think they're studying what we do when we lose." She kept her eyes on the track. "Say more." "The loop is designed to be unwinnable. Everyone dies. The cycle resets. The people who remember know they're going to die again and they can't stop it, but they keep trying. Every cycle they try. They find new approaches, new variables, new ways to understand the problem. Even Silas, in his broken way, was trying to solve it. Even the ones who don't remember are the decisions they make in the cycle. Those decisions are still choices, still resistance. He looked out at the dark forest. "I think that's the anomaly they can't classify. They can model our deaths. They can't model why we keep trying anyway." The structure was partially visible from 200 meters out, a dark mass rising from the forest floor, geometric in a way that had nothing to do with geology, covered in the slow overlay of 11 years of vegetation that had done almost nothing to disguise its fundamental alienness. It was not large. It was about the size of the Cassidy's cargo hold, and it hummed, a sound below hearing, something you felt in the back of the jaw and the base of the sternum. Dara parked the rover as close as she dared. She got out, and the night air was cool and full of the smell of the forest. And she stood looking at the structure for a moment. And then she said, "Give me the handset." Ren handed it to her. She called Hessa. "We're in position. Array is calibrated." Hessa's voice was tight. "Timer shows reset window in 11 minutes. I need your confirmation at -2. You'll have it." She found the spot by feel as much as calculation. The angle where the Cassidy's array, 3 kilometers away on the pad, would have a direct sight line to the structure's upper surface. She set up the portable relay Hessa had rigged. A stripped-down unit from the ship's emergency comm kit, held together with adhesive, and the particular kind of improvisation that 3 years of courier runs in under-maintained equipment had made second nature. It looked like nothing that should work. Hessa built things that looked like that. At -2 minutes, she keyed the handset. "Confirm." "Confirmed," Hessa said, starting injection sequence. And then they waited. Structure's hum changed at the 1-minute mark. A shift in frequency, the way a machine shifts, when it moves from idle to active. Dara stood in the dark forest, next to a relay that looked like it had been assembled by an inventive child. And she thought about 11 years. She thought about Petra counting cycles in the hundreds, and losing count. She thought about the colonists in the square, singing, not knowing. Shh. She thought about the 2 ships before the Cassidy, and the crews that had followed Silas's voice into the dark, and she thought about the fact that she was standing here at all. That she had come down when a saner person might not have. That Ren and Hessa were here with her. That the 3 of them had spent the last 18 hours working this problem with everything they had. She thought about Ren's question. Why we keep trying anyway, she thought. Because we are built for it. Not because our biology makes us strong, or our technology makes us powerful, though both have their moments, but because the thing in us that reaches toward a problem we can't solve and refuses to stop reaching is not a flaw. It is the whole point. It is the oldest thing we have, older than ships or language or fire. The thing that was there when the first hominid looked at a sky full of stars and didn't feel crushed by the scale of it, felt instead, somehow called. The relay activated. She felt it more than heard it, a vibration in the air, change in the quality of the dark. The structure's hum stuttered, faltered, and then Hessa's voice in the handset, low and precise. Injection live. Overlay at 60%. Hope they were transmitting was everything. The Cassidy's full data logs, every record the ship carried. Navigation data, personal files, cargo manifests, engineering reports, medical records, the automatic Stoltold Starship logs that the ship's system kept of every conversation held within its hull. Hundreds of accumulated gigabytes of human existence, in all its mundane and extraordinary density. Every argument and joke and discovery, and moment of boredom. Every song Hessa hummed to herself in the engine room. Every navigational calculation Ren ran for practice. Every note Dara had made in the past 18 hours. Broadcast directly into the structure's reset signal, layered over whatever sanitized report the wards had prepared, contaminating the output with an amount of raw, unclassified, contextless human data that no study protocol could metabolize cleanly. You want to not us? Dara thought, here. All of it, everything we are. Let's see you sort that out. The structure's hum hit a frequency she could feel in her teeth. And then something happened that she did not have a category for. A pressure change. Light that wasn't light. A sensation of immense attention. The way it feels when something vast turns its regard toward you. She stood her ground. She had Ren's shoulder to her left and her hand on the relay, and she stood her ground. The reset window closed. The signal died. And then the sky lightened. Not the colonial morning, not the reset, not the programmed return to the same day. The actual sky, lightening in the east, the way a sky lightens when a night is ending and a real morning is beginning. The color changing by degrees from black to deep blue to the preliminary gray of genuine dawn. Hessa's voice very quiet. The navlock just cleared. Dara looked at Ren. His face in the growing light was doing several things at once. Go start the rover, she said. They drove back to the colony, in a silence that was not empty but full. The kind of silence that forms when something large has happened and the words for it haven't arrived yet. The forest was lighter than it had been. The trees looked like trees. When they came out of the tree line and into the colony clearing, there were already people in the square, and they looked different. The smoothness was gone, the scripted ease, the pleasant blankness. They looked like people who had just woken from a long and troubled sleep. Some of them were sitting down, some of them were crying, some of them were simply standing and looking at their hands. Petra was in the square. She saw Dara coming, and walked toward her and stopped a few feet away and stood there, and the thing that moved across her face this time was completely legible. It's done, she said. It's done. Petra put her hands over her mouth. She stood like that for a moment, and then she lowered her hands and said, "What did you do?" "Junk mail," Dara said. Basically. Petra let out a sound that was almost a laugh, and not quite. They found Silas in his building, sitting in front of his display array, was showing nothing. The cycle map had gone dark. The markers were gone. He looked up when they came in, and his face was complicated. Not guilty, exactly, not relieved. Something in between, the face of someone who has been doing the wrong thing for a very long time, and the sincere conviction that it was the only thing, and has just learned that he was mistaken. "It's over," Dara said. He looked at his dark display. "Yes," he said, "I can see that. You tried to have us killed. I tried to maintain the study conditions." He said it flatly, without defense, as if the distinction mattered less to him now. "I believed that was the path out. I was wrong. People died every cycle regardless. He stopped. I thought I could make the deaths mean something, make them part of a negotiation." He looked at his hands. They weren't negotiating, were they? No. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who has just understood a thing he should have understood much earlier, and the weight of the delay is something he is going to carry for a long time. Ovar was at the door behind them. Dara looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "She'll want to know it's over." "She already knows," Ovar said. He had been crying recently. He was done, now, or mostly done. The tears had dried, but the rawness was still there. She was watching from the perimeter. She saw the sky change. The colonists spent that morning doing something that Dara had not expected to witness and would not forget. They gathered in the square, fear, all of them. The ones who had lived in the loop knowing, and the ones who had lived it not knowing, and the ones who were only now beginning to understand what had been done to them. And they stood together in the early light of a morning that was not the same morning they had been waking to for 11 years, and they were quiet. Not the blankness of the loop's quiet, the quiet of people who have something to say and are taking a moment to find the words. And then, without anyone seeming to decide it, they began to sing. The same songs from the square at sunset, the songs from Earth. The words that get carried everywhere humans go because you can't leave them behind. You don't even want to. But different now, slower, and rougher at the edges, and with something underneath them that hadn't been there the night before. A weight, a knowledge, a particular kind of gratitude that you only feel when a thing that seemed permanent has turned out not to be. Dara stood at the edge of the square with Hessa and Ren and listened. Hessa was humming quietly along, barely audible. Ren was just listening, still and intent, with his eyes slightly too bright. We need to get a message out, Dara said. They'll need a relief ship. Medical, psychological, supply. Already drafted, Hessa said. Sent it as soon as the navlock cleared. Dara looked at her. When? While you were driving back. Hessa shrugged. I had time. Dara looked back at the square, at the circle of people, at the faces. She thought about the wards. Wherever they were, whatever came next. She thought about a signal landing somewhere, in some receiver, carrying not the clean data of a controlled study, but 11 years of colony life, and 3 days of Cassidy logs all tangled, together in a mess that no taxonomy could cleanly sort. She thought about whatever decision got made, somewhere, by something old and large, when it received that contaminated report. Whether it had been frustration or bewilderment, something that in a human mind you might call revision. She thought, I hope it gave them something to think about, she thought. We usually do. One of the colonists, a young man toward the outer edge of the circle, someone who had probably been a child when the loop started and had grown up, inside it, never knowing his whole life that his whole life was a loop, turned and looked at her, direct, clear-eyed. He raised one hand. Not a wave exactly. More like an acknowledgement. Like he was saying, I see you, you were here. She raised her hand back. The singing continued. The sun climbed the sky, the real sky, the sky of a day that would actually end and be followed by a different day, and the light moved across the square and touched every face, and the people of Ethera Station stood in it and let it. Ren said finally, softly, I've never been so glad we broke down. We didn't break down, Dara said. They moved us. I know. He glanced at her. Still. She thought about 31 light hours. Traveled in the night without engines. Deposited in the orbit of a place that needed them. She thought about the Cassidy, sitting on the landing pad, drives warm, nav clear, ready to go. She thought about the choice they had made when they came down, when it would have been perfectly reasonable not to, when the smart play was to mark the beacon as anomalous and file a report and continue to their destination. She thought, we did not do the smart thing, we did the human thing, and she thought most of the time, those are the same. Colony stood and sang in the morning of the first new day it had seen in 11 years. The Cassidy sat on the pad with a clear nav lock and a full tank and a crew of 3 people who had a cargo of agricultural microprocessors that nobody was going to die without. There was work to do. Message traffic to manage, colonists to help, a relief ship to coordinate, a report to write that was going to require some very careful language in the section about the wards. And what had been done to interrupt their study. For now, for just this moment, they stood in the square and listened. And somewhere impossibly far away, something received a signal. Read it. Found it unusable. Found it unclassifiable. Found it full of songs and cargo manifests and engineering notes and arguments and jokes. And the particular irreducible noise of 3 humans going about their lives. 3 humans who had looked at a loop designed to be unwinnable and asked, in their very particular way, the question that had never stopped producing answers. What happens if we just don't give up? The answer, as it turned out, was the same as it had always been. Everything.